Welcome everyone to the State of the Bird for the fourth quarter of 2023. This one is titled, Where Did That Quarter Go? Because it went by fast. So a little bit about the State of the Bird. It's a presentation explaining what's going on in the project, and it's an interactive event for the community. Except this video isn't. We had some issues, some technical issues during the live recording of this, which is when this is generally interactive. So I'm actually now redoing this event offline. Or redoing this entire presentation offline, so it's not actually interactive. But we'll talk more about that towards the end of the presentation. All right, anyways, so we're gonna start off with the retrospective. So what happened this past quarter? So our last State of the Bird was on November 19th, 2023. You can find it in the YouTube playlist. The next one is tentatively scheduled for April 19th, 2024, which is about 3 weeks after the end of the quarter. It varies, depends on what I have going on, whether or not we get it done or not. But that's the tentative date for it to come out. Just, subscribe on YouTube. You'll see it pop up in the playlist. It'll be fine. All right, so last steps. These are things that we said we're going to do between the last State of the Bird and this State of the Bird. This is a new slide here. I always meant to put this in, but I apparently always forgot to do it. So this is just so we can go over that stuff real quickly. So the first thing was finishing adding new functionality to the contact list. We have some of that done, but not all of it. A big part of that is we still have the old contact API and the old buddy list API. When those two are sorted out, we'll be able to add more of the stuff to the contact list. But we did add some new features to be able to do the contact or the custom contacts menu, so plugins can add stuff to that. We'll talk more on that later specifically. But so there is some stuff there, but not quite as far as I hoped we were going to get. Aside from that, we need to finish converting to the new status API. The new status API is we're close. So the core handles everything right, but we don't have the user interfaces pieces done yet, and we don't have the protocols moved to it yet. But we're getting there. So progress is made, not fully, but progress was made. We want to finish integrating the history API. That didn't happen. There's a lot that needs to happen there, and I think I took this off the list for this State of the Bird, just because there's so much more that we need to do, and it's not going to happen between now and then. And then aside from that, having me use Pidgin 3 for IRC full time. I did this for a while, but there's a lot of stuff we have to do to make this more enjoyable. Like, it's not super obvious when you get disconnected, and when you reconnected properly, it's not positive whether or not you are still in a channel or not, stuff like that. So I haven't been using this for a couple of weeks as we try to sort out some of that other stuff, but then we'll be getting back into that here shortly. All right, next up, we're going to get into our metrics. So this quarter, we had 3 contributors. It's the same we had for the last 2 quarters. This ebbs and flows a lot. It's not really a big deal. It's just to give you an idea of how many people are actually working on it. The majority of this work is myself and QLogic, but there's additional people like Ivanhoe, stuff like that drop in from time to time too. But the majority of the people adding or opening pull requests, I should say, are QLogic and myself. So, all right, next up, review request. So we know we had a lull last year around Q2 and Q3. I was super inundated with work and contract work and stuff like that, and I burned out for a while. But you can see we sprung back up pretty well. We're not quite to our record that was Q3 of 2022. I think that's our record. But pretty solid numbers, especially considering there's only 3 contributors there, right? So that's 2.7 pull requests a day-ish. Actually, no, a quarter's 90 days. So yeah, that's like 3 pull requests a day. That's not bad. That's a pull request for each person per day. That's obviously not how it plays out, but on average, that's what it is. That's pretty impressive in my opinion. All right, next up, issues. We haven't done a whole lot with the issue tracker. We've been trying to, I've been trying to track stuff in the issue tracker so I can have some metrics so people have an idea of how close we are to an alpha. But that gets really hard because I end up putting a lot more work into writing the tickets, and I could just do the work. So a lot of the time, if something's real simple, I just do the work right away, blah, blah, blah. But so there was 14 issues opened and 8 were closed. Some of these that were closed were older ones or stuff that people thought was a bug but wasn't a bug or was something else, something like that. I don't remember the specifics because the support stuff I don't tend to remember much, to be honest with you. But that is what it is. All right, commits. You can see we had a whole lot of Pidgin 3 commits, 229. So generally speaking, each one of these commits was a pull request, because the pull requests when they come in, even though they can support multiple commits, we typically just do each pull request as a single commit. So you see we've got 229 for Pidgin, 31 for GPlugin, 2 for Pidgin 2, 3 for HASL, 7 for Birb. Birb's a new library we'll be talking about later, and 24 for Xeme. Xeme is another new library, which we'll be talking more about later. But so that's, just give you a rough idea of where the amount of work is going is right there. All right, with the infrastructure, we're still struggling with the web crawlers on HGKeeper. They have been a big pain in my butt. But we have tried to lighten the load on HGKeeper as much as possible. Previously, we weren't using a commit hook or a change set hook on HGKeeper to tell Team City when new commits were in. So every couple of minutes, Team City was asking HGKeeper if there's new commits, right? And that happened all the time. So we were hammering the crap out of it. We've since resolved this. So HGKeeper's been a lot more stable, but we still need to get some sort of caching layer or something in there. But we're doing a lot better than we were, but we're still HGKeeper stops or times out on a health check request at least once a day yet still, which is better than constantly, but it's still something that needs to happen. So developer.pidgin.im, it's now a static site. This previously was an Edgewell track instance that we put into a read-only mode about 3 years ago. The intent of putting in a read-only was to start converting everything over to the new Pidgin.im site. We're gonna the plan with Pidgin.im is most likely that we're gonna break it back up into another developer or dev or something like that. Pidgin.im. Because the site ends up having way more information than it should for general users, right? Pidgin's a end user facing application, right? So like we don't need to have all that. Like our users may be developers, but the vast majority of them aren't, right? So we need something that's more user focused on our main webpage, and we can put the developer stuff somewhere else. But so I ended up crawling this developer.pidgin.im with wget to get a nice static site. That's now just being served by Nginx. And it's just it is what it is. It's way faster. We were able to tear down the Apache instance running track, the Postgres database that was backing it, the volumes that were backing all that, blah blah blah. We saved a lot of resources doing this. And this is something I should have done a long time ago. This was another site that would get destroyed by web crawlers. The track database isn't really optimized. Is a nice way to put it. So queries took really long and they'd time out, and the service would just be really slow, and then it would start dropping stuff. But now it's a static site, so it's super fast. Next up, we finally set up status2.pidgin.im. So not that anybody really cares, but we have status.pidgin.im that keeps a high level. Well, it looks at most of our services and it does a health check on them fairly frequently. I don't remember what the interval is. But the problem was sometimes that would crash. It ends up that but the problem is sometimes that would crash. And what ended up being the issue was the Ansible I built to deploy it. I never actually enabled the service in systemd. So it wasn't starting at boot and it wasn't restarting, or in systemd wasn't restarting it. But we wouldn't know about that until one day I'd be like, why isn't status working? And I'd go to status.pidgin.im and see it's not working. And I kept saying, oh, I need to get another version of this, another instance of this up and running in Kubernetes, because status.pidgin.im runs on a separate separate VPS, and it's checking almost everything in Kubernetes. So we need something in Kubernetes to make sure that's still up and running, right? So we need to be looking at it from both sides. So then we can keep an idea of so then we can see when either one of them goes down, right? If they're down, now they should be restarting. Everything should be fine, but either way, we'll get notifications for that. We also stood up Finch.im. We'll get more into this in a little bit later, but we're trying to separate Finch from Pidgin, and basically let Finch step out of Pidgin's shadow. And this is one of the first things is to give Finch its own landing site. Get it? Because they're birds. Um, so there's supposed to be an about page, but it's not working right now. We just have a blank Hugo page. I need to look at that. I haven't had the time to sit down and figure out what's going on there yet. But it's up and running. So if you want to go see it, check it out. And if you want to work on it, let me know. As for Pidgin 2, there haven't been any releases. We have 2.14.13 just about ready to go. I was hoping to get it ready to go and get it released as part of this presentation, but just time it just didn't line up. There's nothing too major in 2.14.13, but we'll see the changelog when we get there. So, all right, let's talk about Pidgin 3 maintainability. We added version macros to every symbol. What this means is you can now get a compile time check if you set the right preprocessor definitions to know if you're using a symbol that is newer than what you're targeting, to see when something got deprecated, if it got deprecated, to see if something got deprecated from a version that's before the one your minimum support, the minimum one you're supporting, stuff like that. The other benefit here is that these version macros are also used to now expose all the symbols. And this was part of QLogic's big project to go ahead and get Pidgin 3 compiling with MSVC, which is scary, but it's doable, believe it or not. There's some issues that might make that very difficult in the future, but we're going to tackle them when we get there. So every single library, single thing we have now has version macros on all of it. You're going to see it as we talk about the other projects too. But yeah, so that's very cool. That makes a lot of things very possible, or that makes a lot of things that were impossible before possible, which is very cool. Next up, we remove Talkatu. We talked about this in the last day of the bird that we were going to remove Talkatu, or that we were close to, or something. I don't remember exactly. And so Talkatu started as a re-implementation of the input and history widgets in Pidgin 2. Basically a clean rewrite that we could do out of tree and kind of experiment and figure out what we needed to do in the GTK 3 world. We then ended up porting it to GTK 4. But it turns out that due to the core UI split of Purple and Pidgin, Talkatu was just GTK based. That made the API basically impossible to use Talkatu in Pidgin 3. Ideally, the only way we could have continued using Talkatu is if we core UI split it again. But then we would have libpurple having messages that were Talkatu messages, or Talkatu no UI messages, right? But we still needed a message type in the UI and blah, blah, blah. It got really messy. And it's only going to get messier as we start getting into emojis and stuff like that. So ultimately it was decided that, hey, Talkatu taught us a lot about what we wanted to do and how to make things move forward. So we went ahead and implemented those in Pidgin 3 and said goodbye to Talkatu. So is what it is. Next up, we started using Pragma message instead of warning. I wasn't aware of this because this has been around since at least the 90s. But hash warning isn't part of the C specification. And stuff like MSVC doesn't support it. However, it does support Pragma message. So we moved to that, and yeah, we typically use warning or Pragma message now just for things that are, it's like, all right, we know this is broken and we need to come back to it, but we need to do something else before we come back to it. So instead of it being lost in the issue tracker or something like that, we drop a Pragma message in the code for it. So there's a couple of those, but nothing too major. Next up, we removed various Windows helpers that were no longer used. So this is stuff like that was specific to Windows. I think one of the big ones was like finding special folders, like the downloads folder, and maybe your documents folder, stuff like that. There's built-ins to glib now for these. So we just don't have to do anything for them anymore. We just call the glib version, it'll give us the right thing. So this is just, maintenance, getting rid of that code. So we also removed all the icons we're no longer using. So you may remember Pidgin 2 has a bunch of icons and menus and special icons for dialogues and stuff like that. We're not using any of that in Pidgin 3, so we just deleted all of them because we're not using them. We don't need them anymore. So next up, we remove the Dr. Mingwei support. This is part of the crash handling stuff on Windows that would drop you a Pidgin.rpt file, which would give you some build information and a stack trace that you could then send to us. Or like when Pidgin crashes, you could then grab that and send it to us, and we can figure out what happened and try to address the issue. The problem is the Dr. Mingwei support we had was a custom fork somebody did like 10-15 years ago. And it has some issues. It doesn't exactly work with the way I'm building Pidgin for Windows now, which if you're very conscious of what's going on in your system on Windows, you'll know that when you close Pidgin, it's actually crashing during the shutdown because of Dr. Mingwei. So like if you check your Windows event log, you'll see that Pidgin crashed on exit. We don't have a solution for that for Pidgin 2 yet, because mostly we still want to get those stack traces and like if it crashes for somebody, but like we also like I looked into trying to fix it and updating to a modern version of Dr. Mingwei, and it is a stupid amount of work. I probably spent 3 hours on it figuring out that I was going to have to spend another 10 or so on it. And it was just like there's just no point in doing this in overhauling all of this when Pidgin 2 is feature frozen, right? So yep. So anyways, we just removed it from Pidgin 3. We are going to do some crash handling. We haven't gotten to it yet, but it is definitely on my list. And it's definitely something that needs to be done for the alpha, because like asking people or trying to walk people through GDB and how to get a backtrace and stuff is not fun. So it's much better if we can just drop a stack trace as we crash. And then the plan is that we'll have a plugin or something that'll look for those stack traces at startup and then ask you to send them to us. Right? Easy peasy. So all right, we also removed all of the images for emotes, because we're just going to be using native emoji fonts now because those things exist. And there's no need for us to carry a million different images for emotes, right? As part of the status cleanup, we removed all of the old status widgets. The old status system is still technically in use. We're real close to getting rid of it, but we don't need the widgets anymore. I mean, we do if we want to switch status, but they're going out, so we need to replace them and stuff like that. So it's just easier from a namespace wise and stuff like that to just get rid of them as we go and build new ones. And then finally, we removed all of the old GTK blist and GTK conf code. Those of you that may recall, GTK conf.c at one point in time was about 12,000 lines of code. That has now been all cleaned up and modularized and in a few much smaller files. All of the UI is now built via GTK Builder XML, and that is just a much more pleasant experience than GTK Conf ever was. GTK blist is in a similar situation. Since the contact list got merged into the main window a while ago, the old GTK blist code was mostly there for compatibility, a couple dialogues and stuff like that. So we ported those things around, got them cleaned up, and then we're able to just delete all that code. So that's a good time too. So there's not a whole lot in the Pidgin 3 modernization, as you can tell, but don't be fooled by the quantity, because these are some big things here. So we completely rewrote the file transfer API. Formerly, this was the purple Xfer API. It's a little weird and clunky. It was still dealing with file descriptors and stuff like that because that's what we had in the 90s and the early 2000s, right? Now we've got IO streams and stuff like that, and yeah, it's a whole different story. We rewrote that completely. The old Xfer API is still there, so we can port everything yet. But this cleans up everything, gets it into our current manager paradigm and everything. And I think the main thing we're waiting on yet is we've got to get the user interface built, and we've got to port the protocol plugins to it. But after that, we should be good. Next up, we created a new join channel API. One of the things we're doing in Purple 3 and therefore Pidgin 3 is we're simplifying the way that we refer to a conversation. So in Pidgin 2, we had instant messages and chats. Now we just have purple conversations. Those had like subclasses, I think, or maybe it was just a type. I don't remember. Get confused because in Purple 3 for a long time we've had purple conversation, purple IM conversation, purple chat conversation. I think there's some reference to them back in Purple 2, but I don't know. It's been forever. But anyways, so we're kind of changing the nomenclature a little bit here too. Most people nowadays don't know what an instant message is. They know them as direct messages, right? And then there's also group DMs. And then a multi-user chat, instead of calling it a chat or a multi-user chat, we're calling it a channel. We did a little bit of research on this before we went with that name, but both Slack and Discord for certain call them channels, and IRC has already called them channels, so it's a pretty common idea that a multi-user chat is named a channel. Anyway, so we built this new channel or join channel API to simplify the way that you're able to join a channel. So in Pidgin 2 and earlier, the protocol used to give back a hash table with a list of keys, and then the user interface would have to like dynamically build the user interface to allow the user to enter in values for those fields, and then it would pass it back to the protocol, and then the protocol would try to join the channel or the chat. As you can tell, like we couldn't do validation. Dynamic AI or not dynamic UI is kind of weird with that kind of stuff. We still have the dynamic UI, but what we did is the protocol now has a join channel request or something like that. I don't remember the exact name. It basically allows you to set the channel name, and then you can set a password or a nickname for you to use in that chat. But what the protocol will do is there's two extra fields in there, one to show the nickname field and one to show the password field, right? So like IRC doesn't allow you to have a custom nickname in a channel. Your nickname is the same across your entire connection. But it does allow you to enter a password for channels that have a password, right? So the UI will ask the IRC protocol for its join channel template or request, whatever, right? And it's going to say, okay, here's one that says nicks aren't supported, but passwords are. So the UI just grabs that. It makes sure that the password field is shown, and it hides the nick field. And then the user just enters it, and then it takes that object it fills with the object the protocol originally gave it, gives it back to the protocol then joins the channel. It's easy peasy, very straightforward. There's no little magic because of the fields and stuff like that, right? It's a statically typed object that has defined fields rather than a hash table that has string keys and who knows what the values are, right? So it should be a bit safer, it should be a bit easier to follow, and definitely should be easier for people to implement in protocol plugins. All right, next up, we started the new idle API. The old idle API is still here, it's still in place. We're going to be swapping it out here soonish, I hope. So we wrote a new idle API because the old idle API is it's based on polling, right? So every minute or so, the idle API goes and looks at all of the potential idle sources, which are not they don't cover everything. Let's go with that. And it's going to ask them every minute if they're idle or not. And as you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, that's really lazy. And that's going to, use a ton of CPU cycles, like when a machine's sleeping or should be sleeping, and it's waking up to check that. Yeah, it's really dumb. So the new idle manager doesn't do any polling. It leaves that up to the idle sources. So for example, there is so right now we only have one idle source. It's for X11, right? Better or worse, I'm still running X, so I built it for that first. And what it does is the X11 idle plugin watches an X atom to change, and when it changes because your machine got locked and went idle or the screen got blanked, then it tells the idle manager that, hey, we're idle. That's it. That's all it needs to do. And more specifically, instead of like um, just saying that we're idle, the plugin will say that this source went idle at this time, right? And then the source will say when it's no longer idle, or tell the idle manager when it's no longer idle. The idle manager will remove it, which gets rid of that time, and that allows us to stack multiple sources, so we can still do fun stuff like we do with the idle maker plugin, where a user can set a ridiculous idle time or something, right? But the other idea here is that, so like in the Linux world, we still have X11 for idle detection. But then we've got the GNOME screensaver and the KDE screensaver, which use a different specification to know when the screen went idle. All right, so that's what Pidgin 2 supports on the Linux side, but it doesn't support X screensaver anymore. I don't run GNOME or KDE, so I don't have that screensaver, so my idle detection doesn't work on Pidgin 2 because that's just the way it is. But with this setup, you can write an idle detection plugin for anything, right? So on Windows, so the Windows API and I think the Mac one too, those aren't event driven, but the idle plugin then can do the polling to see, hey, are we idle yet? Are we idle yet? Right, and then it can tell the idle manager when we went idle. So we can't necessarily get away from the polling entirely, but we're backing it up, so like we don't need to have it everywhere, which is a good thing. Sorry, you probably just learned way more about idle API than you ever cared to, but yeah. So next up, we've got the new Presence Manager API. This is one of the big pieces that's needed for the new status system. The Presence Manager works on purple saved presences. And it has a property named active, which is the active saved presence. And protocol plugins or anybody can just monitor that property and they can find out when the new status is. This was going to be the way that I was going to have protocol plugins detect when your status changes. But in some discussions with Ian Robb, he made a very good case for the Presence Manager calling into the protocols, because this is part of the core conversation or core like chat implementation, right? And you don't want people to like miss that because they didn't add a signal or they typoed a signal or something like that, right? So we're probably going to go ahead and do that. But so in Pidgin 2, the status system is super complicated. But one of the things that happened was the global presence, right? So like the drop down and text box at the bottom of the contact list or the buddy list window, that controlled your global status, which has its own presence and all this other stuff that then it would try to coerce into the right presence for a protocol plugin and stuff like that. LibPurple's not going to do any of that because it's never going to be 100% correct at it, right? So what we're doing instead is the new presence system API. I believe we have everything covered. We'll add more stuff as we need to. But what'll happen is when you set your global presence, you're not setting a presence object, which is like a full implementation or full instance of somebody's presence. You're just using a purple saved presence, which is basically like, we use purple saved presence because we can save those to disk and we can quickly reload them, and they just have the properties that a protocol plugin can just query them and then set their presence object on their account. Or more specifically, when that changes, they can go ahead and tell their server, the remote end, whatever, what their presence is, and then they can update their account's presence directly according to what it should be on that network, right? So like some chat networks support an invisible primitive, right? Which means you can send and receive messages, but people see you as offline. Not every protocol supports that. So like in Pidgin 2, if you had an IRC account on and an XMPP account, I think XMPP does invisible, you wouldn't actually be able to go invisible because the IRC account didn't support it. So Pidgin wouldn't allow you to select it because it wouldn't work. I think that got changed at some point, but I know that was part of the deal at that point. But the idea here is, we're not trying to let LibPurple make those decisions. It's up to the protocol, right? So if you say you're invisible, cool. XMPP is going to set it, and then IRC is not. We're going to need some way to display those disconnects. It's probably going to be in the account list, but we haven't done that yet. And I'm not sure that's the best place. because I don't necessarily want to put a set presence on an account in there, but maybe, I don't know. That's one of those things that's like, there's so much more infrastructure in libpurple to work on and get working before we start worrying about those details. But, it's one of those things that's on my mind. All right, for GPlugin, we released 0.42.0 and 0.42.1 on November 16th. I don't remember why we had to kick out another release right away, but I'm sure it was something silly. So, we added the versioning macros to everything. Like I mentioned earlier, you're going to see that on all of the projects. We updated the minimum dependencies to GTK 4.10 and glib 2.76. That's what we're required in Pidgin right now, I believe. So that's okay. We also added Gmodule as an internal dependency. So GPlugin uses Gmodule to open up native libraries to load them as plugins and stuff like that. We didn't have this declared as an internal dependency or in our package config or something. I don't remember the specifics. But when somebody would end up linking to us, that would then become a problem, and they would have to add Gmodules to the linker, blah, 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 or to the linker flags, blah, blah, blah. Now that just doesn't matter because in our package config, we say it's an internal dependency, and package config does the right thing. And we're good to go. So the dependencies for tests got fixed. GPlugin has a bunch of plugins, as you may have guessed, that it uses for unit test. However, the test executables didn't have dependencies set on the plugins that they actually depended on. And this fixed that. So like if you just ran the unit test from like a clean build, they would fail because the unit test would get created before the plugins would get built or something like that. I remember the specifics. QLogic ran into this and made the fix, but I confirmed it was working, but this was 4 months ago at this point. Well, yeah. So I don't remember all the details. That was obviously found while with other problems with the unit test on Windows, which were also addressed. So those two combined fixed unit tests being ran in slightly different ways on every platform, but then it also fixed them on Windows. And I already mentioned the version macro style symbols as well. All right, Talkatu, it's been retired. I think I took it out of docs.imfreedom.org already because there's just no need for it to be there. I also removed it from Team City and stuff like that because there's just no reason using the resources when the repositories are archived and retired. All right, Finch no longer builds by default. And that's because we're looking for a new maintainer. We've tried to keep it running, but the problem is nobody uses it. And by nobody, I mean me, QLogic, and Ivanhoe. None of us run it. So trying to keep any of us motivated to keep it running and keep it up to date with the changes we're making in libpurple are just not happening, right? And that's fine, right? I'm not expecting anybody to take it over. But if anybody's interested in working on it, please let me know. Because before the next State of the Bird, I'm planning on pulling Finch out of our repository. This is something I'm going to be doing right after we release Pidgin 2.14.13. Because Finch will still release as part of that build. I feel like so when I pull it out of the repository, it's going to have all the branches. And we could still leave the Finch code in the release 2.x to Y branch, and then we can we can commit to both repositories anything we have for Finch, which is not great, but it's one way to go. But that's kind of where we're going, right? I'm willing to pay a little bit more for the maintenance there, just so we can get it out of our tree and get the warnings out of there. And yeah, because right now Finch is just slowing us down. That's one of the reasons why we turned it off by default. But both QLogic and myself have done pull requests that have affected Finch, and we're still updating Finch even though it's disabled by default. And we're, like I said, we're not using it. So yeah. But this is part of the thing of trying to let Finch out of Pidgin's shadow. So the plan is Finch does still build and run right now. And when I pull it out to its own repository, we're going to pin it to the version of libpurple that we pulled it out on, right? So it should just be in the exact same state for Finch 3 that it is right now. And then somebody can pick up from there. That said, we're not going to slow down for it, so it's going to start bit rotting right away. But I'm willing to mentor somebody who breathes some life into it. But yeah, it's not going to be me working on it, is all I know for certain. So, all right, HASL. Those of you that don't know, HASL is our hassle-free authentication and security library. This is to replace Cyrus HASL or GNU HASL. We don't have any releases. We've got a couple minor things here that are done, but we haven't released them yet. But we're just pinned. We have the sub project pinned to the revision that has this stuff. But basically, we rolled back libidn to a minimum 1.38. If I remember correctly, FreeBSD didn't have 1.40 or something. So to keep building on FreeBSD, we had to go back to 1.38. It's not a big deal. We don't need anything in the newer versions. We were just picking the newer versions because that's what was there. So yeah, as expected, we added versioning macros to all the symbols. Not going to talk too much more about that. And then there's also a bunch of various Meson cleanups. Since we were early adopters of Meson, we've grown some tech debt in there. This is just cleanups, trying to deal with that debt and go from there. All right, Birb. Birb is a new glib-based utility library for Common Code. So right now, it has adopted purple queued output stream as Birb queued output stream. What this does is typically a G output stream, you can only have one write active at a time, which makes writing an asynchronous chat client really difficult. So we have a queued output stream, which will queue up separate messages, and then it'll try to, and when it gets a successful write, it'll try to keep writing everything it can asynchronously until it's exhausted the queue or it hit an error or something. We pulled this out to Birb because of the new library Xeme, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. But this is something that's helpful for others too. What we might also do with the queued output stream is so one of the other things we need in Pidgin 3, and we have it in Pidgin 2 now for IRC, is we have rate limited connections. And we might add the rate limiting directly to Birb queued output stream, or we might write a rate limiter stream that Birb queued output stream can wrap or something like that. I don't know. We got to figure that out. But that's another reason for it to go in here, because we need rate limiting for a bunch of stuff. And so do other people. So instead of everybody writing their own implementation, let's make a library that does all of it. And right now, the only other thing in Birb is the new Birb action menu. I mentioned earlier in the contact list stuff that we've got the context menu stuff more or less done, I think. I don't remember specifics. It's hard to keep track of every single thing that's going on. But so in Pidgin 2, we had a signal that was like populate menus. And when that would happen, like the UI would grab that, and then it would ask the protocol or plugins for menu items to add for like a buddy or a contact or a chat or a conversation member or something like that, right? And then it would add it to the menu. With the way menus work in GTK3 and GTK4, you can't exactly do that anymore because there's now two pieces to the way menus work. You don't just like assign callbacks to them like you used to in GTK2 and earlier. So what you do now is you end up creating a G menu, which is a UI agnostic menu. And then you have to have a G action group, which is actions that are essentially your callbacks. And those have to have a prefix and all this other stuff, blah, blah, blah. Birb action menu works as a collection to have those three parts: the prefix, the menu, and the action items, or in the action groups. And none of that is UI specific code, which allows us to use it in libpurple. And then everybody else can just plug into that and go from there. Yeah. So that's Birb. As we think of new things to go into Birb, we'll obviously add them. I thought we had some more, but I can't recall what it was off the top of my head. I've got a list somewhere, I believe, of what was planned for Birb. But this is, as we need stuff now, that's where it'll go. All right, next up, Xeme. Xeme is our new glib-based XMPP library. It is a high-level XMPP parser, which means it works with XML data types, not raw XML. So one of the problems we have with our current XMPP implementation is it's dealing with the XML DOM, and it is ridiculously hard to follow, especially when somebody is not totally engrossed into the XMPP specifications and all of the extension protocols. By building a high-level parser, we're implementing things much cleaner when it comes to the XMPP extension protocol or proposals and stuff. Real quick idea of how this works is in XML, you can have a namespace on an element. That namespace in XMPP typically defines the XMPP extension protocol that it was created for and includes a version in there. So what we're doing is we have an entire class and everything so that you give it the element name that you have, you give it the XML namespace, and then it'll call you, and then we have a class for that for an XMPP extension that has a parse method, which will then go ahead and let you parse your block exactly as you need to, and everything's just separated out and works the way it needs to be. So this way we're compartmentalizing the implementation a lot, so we're not getting a lot of spaghetti code with tons of conditional stuff like that, right? It's, hey, I hit this body element with a namespace of whatever the carbon namespace is. I'm going to call, or I'm going to then ship this over to this XML parser. It's going to go do what it needs to do. When it comes back, I can go look at the next sibling, right? So the code is way easier to follow. It should be way easier to implement, especially when it comes to dealing with ZEPs that are deprecated or we're going to remove and stuff like that. Everything should just be easier because of that. Aside from that, we have basic input and output streams are implemented. So I've been developing this in combination with a new XMPP implementation in Pidgin, well, in Purple 3, and connecting to our normal XMPP instance that we run, or our normal Prasadi instance that we run. Doing it that way has been kind of challenging, but it's okay. We don't have direct TLS connection set up on that instance, so you have to do start TLS. So right now I'm through the basic handshake, and we're going through the stream features right now, and the first thing I have to handle is upgrade to TLS via start TLS. I don't have that part finished yet, but that is the next part I'm working on. And then we should go from there. Oh, I kind of skipped through that in the notes here, right? So the start TLS comes through as a stream capability. And it's a required stream capability. The server is going to tell us it's required. And that's the first one that comes out. So we have to handle that one first because that's how it works. So once we get start TLS implemented, we can then finish the rest of the stream capabilities, and then we can actually hopefully start getting to sending messages. We still have to support information queries and messages, obviously, but slowly but surely we're getting there. And we'll have a new out of tree XMPP library that anybody can use, and it'll be good to go. At least that's the idea. All right, setbacks. Not really any with the project. I've been busy doing contracting work, stuff like that, so I haven't been able to get in as much time as I want, but we've still been getting a fair amount of time, right? We can see that in the metrics. So there's nothing that like really slowed us down or anything, which is good. Yeah. All right, so demo time. So for the demo, there's not a whole lot more to show, right? All of the new stuff that came out has been mostly API stuff, right? So you can't really see it. A few things to note is the contact, or so we generalized the info pane. That's this part here, right? So traditionally the info pane was only shown for conversations, right? So like here's the team list or the member list, blah, blah, blah. But now it's in contacts too because we've generalized it. And we can also pack other widgets in it. So like as we're searching through the contact list, right, we can see that that works. Also, if you just start typing in here, the search will automatically go there. So that's cool. There's supposed to be an icon here. We just don't have one defined for the contact list yet. We'll get there at some point. We just haven't picked one yet and make it work. Yeah. Aside from that, everything else is pretty much the same. Oh, yeah, this got disconnected because that instance isn't running anymore. I got to figure that out. But the next biggest thing, which is nice, is we finally got keyboard shortcuts working. So this changed. We don't have conversations automatically focused yet. That's a long story. Somewhere between GTK 3 and GTK 4, I don't remember where, they completely changed the way Windows shortcuts work, and we just didn't notice. So forever we had the menu stuff up here, and there just wasn't, like, we'd hit Control M or Control Q and it wouldn't work. But we've now figured that out. We've got that all working. It works application wide, blah blah blah. So everything's nice and good. The Echo bot, as you all know, just outputs whatever you say back to it, and it's good to go. But yeah, that's pretty much it for our new stuff in Pidgin 3. And then obviously Control Q will then kill the program too. So yeah, that's basically it for the demo. All right, so our next steps. So these are the things we're going to be working on now between now and the next State of the Bird. I definitely want to have the new XMPP protocol plugin doing direct messages. Adding support for MUX is going to take a bit more work. There's a whole lot more ZEPs you have to go through to make that work properly. But just doing direct messages should be okay. We also want to have the new Bonjour protocol plugin started. I forgot to mention this. One of the reasons Xeme exists is because in Pidgin, or before now, basically, we've had Bonjour and an XMPP protocol plugin. And Bonjour uses MDNS to find other contacts on your local LAN. But to actually converse with them, it uses XMPP. So before Xeme, the XMPP plugin, or the Jabber plugin is what it was called previously, had its own implementation of XMPP. And the Bonjour protocol plugin had its own implementation of XMPP. If you're saying that's too many implementations of XMPP, I agree. This is why we created Xeme, right? So the big part of Xeme is it's high-level parser that's easier for people to jump in and add support and stuff like that, right? But now it's also a library that we can easily use from both protocol plugins, and then other people can use it and stuff like that, and everybody's happy, right? And we're not, re-implementing XMPP a million times, which is a good thing. So, I want to have the old status system completely replaced. I should say replaced and removed. But we're close to that, right? So once we finish up the presence, the save presence UI, which I'm near on right now, and then we get, I don't really want to port the old Bonjour and the old XMPP protocol plugin. I want to have the new ones using the new presence system, because at some point we're going to delete the old Jabber protocol plugin and the old Bonjour plugin. Which is why we need to get those stuffs going. And obviously it's going to be much easier if we can get the old status system out of the way. And then for real this time, well, we're going to take another run at having me using Pidgin 3 for IRC full time. We're going to, like I said, we're going to address those issues we had and go from there. So that's the idea. All right, so closing notes. So we had a bunch of issues with this State of the Bird. A bunch of them were related to technical issues. Like I had to start and stop the live stream for this 3 times before we got it going. And then I forgot to do a local recording in OBS. So I was like, all right, I'll go download the VOD, except I was messing with audio settings in the VOD, and the VOD ended up not having any audio. So what that means is, so all of that, keep all of that in mind. And I've been trying to figure out if there's value in the State of the Bird. The idea of it has always been to try to give people an idea of what's going on in the project without trying to get, for people that don't want to follow the day-to-day stuff, which is completely understandable. The problem is we end up packing a lot of stuff into these, and they end up going about an hour. And that's a lot for people to watch if, like, they're not, grossly involved in the project. And it's understandable, right? So the next State of the Bird might be something different. We might do smaller, more frequent, or we might just do a blog post. I don't know. We're going to figure that out. We're going to take a real good hard look at this and decide. Because like if I look at the YouTube metrics, they're not great, right? Each State of the Bird gets like 100 to 200 views, and nobody's watching the entire thing. And then when I do this live, which is how it's normally done, we have the entire question section, and generally speaking, we get maybe 1 question on average. And that just kind of, it's deflating. Let's go with that. Let's be honest, right? Because, I mean, you all know I put a ton of work into this project. It is a huge part of my life. And now putting the state of the bird together, it doesn't take a whole lot of time. It's probably about 4 to 5 hours tops, including editing and everything. This one's gonna be longer, obvious, because I'm having to do the entire thing again. But like, you put all this work in, and then nobody's interested, or people are making really dumb jokes, and it's just like, why am I doing this, right? Um, so like I said, we're gonna take a real hard look at this. We're gonna try to decide what to do, what makes more sense. Maybe it's a blog post, right? I don't know. We'll see. But if you have any ideas, be sure to drop them in a comment below. And yeah. So with that, if you don't mind, make sure you like the video too. That'd be cool. But yeah, with that, we'll see you in April. So have a good one, and thank you everybody who made it this far. Have a good one.